and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel, and well, it's time for another monthly reading wrap-up. The month of September wasn't terribly good for my personal life and mental health, but it was another astoundingly good reading month because I managed to down 14 books. I mean, alright, it was more 13 and I just finished the 14th book. As I did with my wrap-up for the month of August, this time around I'll be going by category of book. But for each category I will be going through what I read in chronological order. Right, so I'll start with the non-fiction. So, first I read this, Stop Caretaking, the Borderline or Narcissist by Margalis Fjelstad. I probably murdered her name, so apologies for that. This is basically a self-help book, I guess. People who are in caretaking/abusive relationships with people who either have BPD or NPD. I read this for personal/information-seeking reasons, and I won't say more than that. It was alright. I didn't get that much out of it, actually, overall. This is gonna sound really weird, but bear with me. I felt like this was addressed to normies. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with being a normie, but if you're a person like me who already has all mental health and specific lifestyle characteristics, etc., like I'm not married, I don't have children, etc., I did feel like a lot of the information was really meant for me and can be applicable to my lived experience. Otherwise, it's alright. There's still helpful bits in there, information about the characteristics of BPD and NPD and things like that, but I was expecting more out of this book, basically. Otherwise, if you're in a traditional marriage with children with a steady job and things like that, yeah, maybe this could be helpful for you. Then I read 4 books about a touchy subject, me at least. It's not really, I feel it's not really a much discussed subject in the Anglosphere, as I call it. It's more relevant in the Francosphere. It's about what is called giftedness, or more specifically intellectual giftedness, so people who have an IQ above 130 on the Wechsler intelligence scale. And again, personal stuff. So briefly, I'll just say I read these 4 books. They're all in French. They include Trop intelligent pour être heureux with a question mark, so Too Intelligent to Be Happy by Jeanne Siaud-Facchin. I found it interesting and helpful, and this is going to be a recurring critique about all of these books and about the topic in and of itself. There's a lot of pseudoscience potentially around the subject of giftedness, especially in France and Belgium. It's a complicated topic, and some of it seems to overlap with the autistic spectrum and Asperger's syndrome in particular. And is it part of neurodivergence? Isn't it? It's kind of a mess. So this lacks sources and scientific evidence, and she's a very controversial figure in that whole area of psychology. Then I also read this, Femme Surdouée by Monique de Kermadec. She's also a popular writer on the subject of giftedness. They're all shrinks, basically, they're psychologists. And this was supposed to address the particular difficulties of women who are intellectually gifted, a bit like some writers or creators on YouTube explore the particular aspects of being a woman with Asperger's syndrome, for example. There were some interesting points about how intelligence is devalued in women, or not as valued as it is in men, and how that impacts sexism and discrimination against women. But it was overall pretty weak, once again. There were more sources than in the previous book I mentioned, but I was like, what's your point here? And I didn't get the point. And I read 2 self-published books because they seemed interesting. I read this, Rayures et Ratures, which is a book made out of a blog, so it was like crowdfunded and stuff. And that was alright. I guess a bit more recent too, so it displayed a bit more critical thinking with regards to the subject of giftedness, and was a bit more aware of, I guess, scientific research on the topic. But, I mean, it was alright, but I didn't get what I wanted out of it. And finally, this disaster of a book, Suivez le Zèbre, which means follow the zebra. So again, in France and Belgium, there's a colloquial term for people who are supposed to be intellectually gifted. They're called zebras. a bit like people with Asperger's syndrome are called Aspies by some, or I mean, they call themselves Aspies, I suppose. This read like a shoddy self-help personal development woo-woo book. I have zero patience for that. Like the first third was alright, had a bit of science behind it again, at least sources, creditable sources. The rest of it just felt like she was trying to preach at the reader, and like she wanted to set herself up as some kind of guru, and the kind of personality that came through the writing just irked me a lot. I hated this book. An absolute total waste of money, unfortunately. So that's that. Onto the graphic fiction. So, first I read this beautiful art book called Chamanes, les Chants de la Déesse. So if you've been following me from the beginning, about a year ago now, you might recall that I did a review for a beautiful art book called A Compendium of Witches by Natasha Ilinsik. And this is a bit like that. Now, I will say I think A Compendium of Witches is better because I just love that artist's art style and the variety of female figures she displayed in her book. But this is kind of the same idea. It's like an art book that features stories around different shamans, female shamans from different cultures. Essentially, the Americas, actually. There are two shamans from Europe, one from the Paleolithic, there's one from Australia, and one from the Middle East. So shamans, priestesses, a general area of expertise, if you will. I became aware of this book by an ad on Facebook, of all things. But the thing is, I actually was already familiar with this artist's work, Jean-Sébastien Rossbach, because he participated in one of my favorite art books of all time, which is an art book about Merlin and the Arthurian legend, which I have in my library. So I was like, oh, he's doing something on his own about female shamans. So feminist-y adjacent stuff, check. Shamanism, earth-based spiritualities, check. Beautiful art style, check. So this was a beautiful book. I do think of Compendium of Witches is better because the variety is greater. Like, there weren't any shamans from Asia or Africa, which was a bit surprising, actually. So I would have enjoyed more stories and more varied stories. But otherwise, a beautiful art book. And then I continued on with two of my ongoing comic book series. First, I read Volume 4 of Sex Criminals, Fourgy. It still remains very entertaining. I've grown fairly attached to the characters. In fact, something happens to one of the main relationships, and I was like, oh no, I don't want that to happen. And it's still very funny and silly. A lot of humor to do with sex and human sexuality, obviously, given the title, but I like that. But I mean, it's clever. It's not gross, rough humor. It's clever. Though perhaps it's one of the weaker entries. I only gave it a 7 out of 10, 7, 8. But I'll definitely be continuing with the series in any case. And then I read Volume 4 of Saga, and this continues to be an insane, wild ride, and I love it. Yeah, I love it, and I'm like, I mean, I can't show it on YouTube, but like the very first page, I was like, oh wow, they really went for it. And there's, I mean, it's not really a spoiler, but in this series there's a race of alien humanoids that have televisions for heads. They're called the robots. And then there's a scene in there with one of the main characters who's a nobleman. His dad is the king of the robots. And I mean, it's a minor spoiler. But so apparently, according to which socio-economic class you belong to, you'll have a different model of television as a head. So there's a scene in there, I just burst out laughing because it was so ridiculous. The king has the ginormous flat screen TV for a head. Like, said like that out of context, it means nothing, obviously, but I looked at that and I burst out laughing. It's so ridiculous. In any case, the characters are precious and varied and interesting. The story is interesting. I'm really enjoying the series. It deserves its reputation, most definitely. And I'm impatient to pick up Volume 5. And then something a little different. I read Poems for Love, edited by Laura Barber for Penguin Editions. I've had this book on my shelf for like 5 or 6 years, but I never got around to actually going through it. And I have this minor pet peeve where I don't actually like to have a book in my library that I haven't read. I do make an exception for, like, you know, field guides for identifying birds or bugs and things like that, you know. You get what I mean? But this was staring at me the other day, or I mean, a few weeks ago, And I was like, yeah, all right, I'm just going to read this, aren't I? So I did. I went through the entirety of this book. It's about 360 pages long, and it features a variety of poems about specifically romantic love, though some of them you could technically apply to most kinds of love, I think. I was a bit disappointed that it was specifically about romantic love. I wanted it to be about love in general, but whatever. And, well, it's an anthology, so you're going to like some poems. You're not going to like some others, and some will just leave you neutral, right? I enjoyed a fair few of them. It's also divided in different sections that have to do with, like, the stage of romantic love, or, like, loving passionately, loving until death, loving forever, loving with jealousy, with anger. It features different periods, different styles. You've got stuff from, like, Christina Rossetti, so the pre-Raphaelites. You've got good old Billy Shakes, obviously. You've got Milton. You've got more modern poets as well. And, of course, I can't remember a single name, because that's always how it works, doesn't it? I will say this, though. The Shakespeare I didn't quite get, apart from the sonnets. Some of the poems are actually extracts from some of his plays. Now, I know his plays were written in verse, but still, I'm like, that's drama. It's not poetry. You're cheating there. He wrote sonnets. I mean, well, some people think he didn't actually write those sonnets, and I had already read them before anyway. Whatever. So, it's a decent collection. That's all I can really say. It does have a very pretty cover, though, so it's got that going for it. And finally, the fiction. So first, I absolutely have to mention the fact that I did finish The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson in the very first week of September. It took me a ridiculous amount of time to finish it. One, because it was on audiobook, and since when I'm not doing well, I don't actually do much with my hands, and I was supposed to listen to the audiobook as I was drawing. Well, I wasn't actually listening to the audiobook then, was I? So I had to remind myself to listen to it, because I didn't have much of it left in the car as I was walking around, and I finally finished it. But two, if I'm being honest with myself, I was a bit bored in the middle of it. Some of the plot was a bit boring, a bit stretched out, so I do believe I gave it a 6 out of 10. I will finish the trilogy, though. I will read/listen to The Hero of Ages. I still like the characters. I like Vin. I really like Siaud. Interactions between the members of the crew. I do like the Condor character, whose name I've forgotten. And I guess the relationship between Vin and what's his name again? The main noble dude was a bit more convincing than in Volume 1. But like there was also a sort of fake out love triangle, and I was like, really? Must we? The ending was good. The ending was kind of a cliffhanger, so it does make you want to pick up Volume 3, and I will do so, and I have no idea how long it's going to take me to actually listen to it, and we shall see what I make of the trilogy as a whole at the end of it. And then I read 3 books, for all of which I did separate distinct reviews, if you want to check those out. First, I'll mention The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. As I stated in my review, I actually really thoroughly enjoyed this. I was quite surprised by how much I enjoyed it. It was fast-paced, it had quite a fair bit of action, and it was fairly thoughtful as well, interesting with the way it created the Martians and the invasion, etc. Like I said, I have a review for that if you're interested. And I read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, so 2 great classics of science fiction, and early science fiction at that, in succession. I also thoroughly enjoyed this one. The writing was just ridiculously gorgeous, so that was a big plus in my book. And the story was quite moving, quite tragic, but also thought-provoking, an interesting examination of human character and other themes, which I also discuss in a review if you'd like to check that out. And then I read Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov, something a little different, a smidge of literary fiction for a change. This was more of a flop, not because it's bad as such, it's just that it didn't really capture my imagination or my interest. It was beautifully written as well, because it's Vladimir freaking Nabokov, and the main character / narrator, unreliable narrator I should say, was interesting, and there was a fair bit of humor in there as well, but it's also metafiction. It's a poem with commentary to it, and that's how the story is told. And I'm really becoming more and more convinced that metafiction just isn't quite for me. unfortunately. Still, I would like to read more Nabokov in the future, but I don't know yet which title I will pick up. And finally, I read The Chrysalids by John Wyndham, an author I discovered by basically watching other booktubers. Had no idea he was the one who wrote The Day of the Triffids, which I thought was just an old-timey sci-fi horror movie. I had no idea it was based on a book. And I picked this one up because the plot sounded interesting. Post-apocalyptic science fiction with mutations, with religious bigotry involved. I gave this a solid 6 out of 10. I did enjoy the story, the setting in particular. So this post-apocalyptic Canada that is populated by fairly religious folks, and the religious folks have commandments against mutations, which obviously are caused by, the leftover radiation from the nuclear apocalypse that happened 500 years ago, and there's still whole swaths of land that are just dead. Vitrified is how it's described. Vitrified to black glass. That's how bad it was. I don't know how many nukes were launched, but it must have been pretty bad. And then you have other regions which are just going nuts with mutation and radiation and things like that. And so the main character is called David, and David can exchange telepathically with other kids, and that would be considered a deviation from the image of God. Man is the image of God, and so it would be considered a deviation from that. So he has to hide away from, normal people, and there's a whole plot with that. The pacing was a bit awkward because most of the action takes place in the last fourth of the book, and most of the theming comes in pretty hard at the end of the book as well. Now, initially, I didn't mind so much. I was like, oh, now you're laying on the theory and the thoughts really strongly. Interesting. But it kind of went overboard into almost preachiness in a weird way. I'm not saying the author was preaching his own beliefs at the reader, but the way it was told through the narration came across that way. So, yeah, that felt a bit off. One of the characters is touting the virtues of being a telepath and being able to share emotions and thoughts. That whole hive mind thing, which you also get in More Than Human. And I was like, all right, calm down there with your superiority complex. This whole, hive minds are better than being an individual human. That particular brand or sub-genre of science fiction has never appealed to me at all. I don't vibe with that at all. I feel like it's all about the advantages of that. It's always presented as so bloody positive, but I'm like, surely there are negatives to that. Can we have a more balanced discussion of that kind of scenario? I would be interested, in fact, to read a book that presents that theme, or that concept in a more neutral fashion, really presenting the advantages and disadvantages of such a setup. But that's another thing. A good enough story, interesting theme, but the delivery of said theme and the presentation of the underlying concept as overwhelmingly positive rubbed me the wrong way, just a bit. And that concludes my wrap-up for the month of September. Now, as I'm filming this, I am still in the month of September, and I've already started another book, but I shall talk about it in October's wrap-up. I've started The Secret Commonwealth by Philip Pullman, and this month I will also be reading another great classic of SFF literature, Dracula by Bram Stoker, and yeah, a vampire story for October. Kind of makes sense, right? In the meantime, I hope you're all doing well. I hope you had a better month of September than I did, reading or otherwise. I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, whichever, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye-bye.